Hello, welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the Denver Art Museum and FOPAS for the time and opportunity to speak with you. This evening, I'd like to share with you some of the thoughts and ideas I've encountered over the last 15 years or so as I've tried to make sense of our current and bewildering contemporary art world. And perhaps, hopefully, some of this may end up being of some use for you. I'll talk for a while, tell my story, and then hopefully there will be some time for some questions afterwards. I'll start with a bit of my background and what led me to this engagement. I'll take a look at the beginnings of modernity, take some big jumps to the 20th century, and then try to unpack some ideas concerning where we are now in the contemporary world. I'm a painter, now Colorado-based, and I lived abroad for most of the 90s. I left the States soon after grad school when I received my MFA from Yale University. I went to find myself as a painter and make my way. I lived in Israel and was pretty secluded from the larger art world, looking at it from a distance. As I did my thing as a painter, exploring, exhibiting, teaching, periodically I would glance through the art magazines or museum catalogs, and what I saw just didn't make much sense to me. And I was quick to dismiss what I didn't understand. Eventually, I returned to the States in the early aughts, moving to the Northeast and exhibiting in New York City, first at Herschel and Adler and then with DFN, both fairly straightforward representational painting galleries. And again, I thought I knew what was what and what wasn't. But as I started to peruse the galleries in Chelsea and Midtown New York, I started to sense that perhaps what I was so sure of wasn't necessarily so. I started to encounter in first person, not through reproduction, what we might call new media, forms that had been developing since the 60s, so half a century, not so new actually. I started to encounter them firsthand in installations, video, post-minimalist, and conceptual art, and found that a good amount of it really hit me as strongly as anything else, and that it was a mix, some good, some not, just like painting, sculpture, and traditional media. And I began to be deeply curious about where we are when we speak of and encounter art, and how in the world did we get here. The period from the end of the 19th century up through the beginning of the 21st century is, of course, a very dense and complex period. I can't possibly do it justice or begin to cover all that has occurred and the various reasons for it, but I'll try to describe this evening in very broad strokes some ideas that I found helpful to begin to come to terms with where we are today in the art world and how we got here, which might hopefully lead to some ideas on what may be called for next. Like life, it's a bit of a meandering tale, and along the way, I'll be giving shout-outs to a whole slew of books that I found just great and extremely helpful. So let me start with some places that we're probably more or less familiar with. Here is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, painted by Picasso in 1907 when he was 26, back in the heyday of early modernism. Looking at it 110 years later, it's still a jarring piece of work, and perhaps fitting for what is to come. When we talk about the modern art world, our origin story generally begins with Impressionism, though certainly a case could be made for starting earlier, perhaps Courbet or Goya, and all the changes that coalesced into the exhibition of the independence and what became the avant-garde. We have our cast of greats: Monet, Pissarro, Renoir, Degas, Manet, among others. We have the shift from the salon as the official arbiter of what is good art to the independent exhibitions and galleries. And we have the next generation of greats stepping up: Van Gogh, Matisse, Picasso. The list goes on, and what I found as I started to dig in to understand how we got to where we are was that a great deal of what allowed these painters to become great, that is, what provided the necessary context for their extraordinary inventions and discoveries and expressions, was a changing world. And this too we know. The great technological, economic, and political changes at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Marx, Darwin, Einstein, Freud. Somewhere along the way, I picked up a book that had been mentioned by Malcolm Gladwell in an article in The New Yorker, a book by David Galenson, who was a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, called Old Masters and Young Geniuses. I need to put this. Galenson sees the quality of innovation as that which makes an artist great. Art, historically speaking, the greater the innovation, the greater the artist, and describes what he finds as two basic biographies of the creative life, one that is more experimental and one that is more conceptual. That is, how the artist arrives at their innovation. If I speak back here, is this okay? I don't have to lean in, right? Lean in? It's better if I lean in? Thank you. But I want you guys to hear it too. Is this better? Really? I can stand straight? Okay. That's clearer. It's better. Okay. No, I'm not going to start over. Okay. Somewhere along the way, I picked up a book that had been mentioned. Right, we did this. Art historically, right. Innovation, great. One that is more experimental and one that is more conceptual. That is, how the artist arrives at their innovation can be through a more physically experimental process in paint, gradually arriving at the hoped-for result, or it can occur through a more conceptual engagement, with the creative process going on more in the mind and the physical process of painting occurring pretty straightforwardly. The experimental painter is uncertain of their road and finds it by going, experimenting along the way. The conceptual painter has a very clear idea of what is to be done and is able to execute them with decisiveness and clarity. And it turns out that these two kinds of creativities tend to occur in different age ranges. That is, the conceptually based artist tends to have their greatest innovations at a younger age, and the experimental one has their greatest discoveries occur when they're older. Hence the title, Young Geniuses and Old Masters. And Galenson uses the pair of Cézanne and Picasso to illustrate this. Cézanne, as an old man, is going through iteration of iteration, exploring ways to come to terms with Mount Saint Victoire. Here he's a bit younger, and then as he's older, he's doing the watercolors and these oils. And it goes on and on, his whole series of them. Picasso, as a young hotshot, knocks out masterpiece after masterpiece. Here is his portrait of his dealer, Ambroise Voillard, from 1910. Now, the challenge for the experimental artist is to simply keep going, because they are usually racked with self-doubt and may very well lack public recognition and support until they are much older or gone. The challenge for the conceptual artist is to keep discovering fresh ideas and innovations as they get older and not to repeat themselves. So how did that play out more broadly? Getting back to the larger cultural shifts that were occurring, there was also a growing shift of economics, and that resulted, in part, in a shift from the salon as the arbiter of worth and quality to the gallery and dealer. The forces supporting the arts moved from the ruling aristocracy to the bourgeoisie and rising merchant and middle class. And with this shift was a growing emphasis on innovation itself. That is, what's new? If the old regime preferred a consistent and steady mode of representation to maintain cultural continuity, the new economics thrived on change and stylistic revision, new and improved. Galenson takes this further in another book, Conceptual Revolutions of the 20th Century, exploring the rise of the conceptual as a category of creativity and its ascendancy in the art world. If we see the history of art in the 20th century as a series of headlines, then conceptually based art eventually becomes the headliner. And it turns out that the conceptual means of innovation, as opposed to the experimental one, is a better fit for a free market economic system. Innovation happens at a quicker pace. New products arrive more quickly and at shorter cycles. It happens sooner. The artist is younger, and there's more time for the investment to mature as time goes by, like a good stock in a company. And the means of dissemination are more efficient. Because the location of meaning is in the idea, one can assess the work through reproduction more easily than a work done through experimentation, where the location of meaning lies more in one's experience in front of the actual physical work. It can often be harder to assess a more experimental piece through reproduction. That's a gross generalization, but more or less true. So the stage was set for a shift from the experimental to the conceptual in the ongoing saga of art's story in the 20th century. Now, not only did we have the great rivals of Picasso and Matisse, both deeply influenced by Cézanne, but we also had the trajectory of Duchamp. Here's Fountain and Bicycle Wheel, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors. These first two works, Fountain and Bicycle Wheel, are ready-mades. That is, they were already fabricated, found objects, and Duchamp made a decision in his mind to call them art. It was a bold, radical, and utterly conceptual determination. In some ways, we might say that one of the great unfoldings of the 20th century was between the lineage of Cézanne, basically experimental, and the lineage of Duchamp, clearly conceptual. And as I just explained vis-a-vis our economic system, the cards were stacked by the dealer towards the conceptual, and the dealer is the market. Now we need to start leapfrogging, for the sake of time and brevity. At the end of World War II, the world was clearly no longer the same world. The United States and the Soviet Union are the two great superpowers, and the center of the art world shifts from Paris to New York. Serge Guilbeault has written a book, How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art. Wrong stack. Which looks at this period of time. It's a fascinating story of intrigue, cultural espionage. The CIA ends up using American art, particularly abstract expressionism, for its own strategic purposes during the Cold War. But of course, there were indeed great aesthetic innovations that were made, and abstract expressionism ruled. Pollock, de Kooning, Rothko. In some ways, it was the last great period in modernity for the experimental lineage. The abstract expressionist painters were by and large engaged in a slow and uncertain undertaking, attempting to give abstract form to intuitive, spiritual, and deeply emotional realms. What came next carried a more and more conceptual lean, which makes sense considering that American economics was becoming more powerful, and with it, the accompanying structural bias. The gallery scene in New York City went from small potatoes to Sidney Janis, Leo Castelli, and the rest that followed. The stylistic shifts, the cycles of innovation, what was cutting edge and avant-garde and what was old hat had started to increase. That is, the turnover moved more quickly. The AbX folks took 20 to 30 years to find their way and to make it. But in only half a dozen years, after they came to prominence, new forms of painting arose and pop art took over. These included works by Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol, to name just a few. In another fascinating book, Changing Images of Pictorial Space by William Dunning, he traces the history of spatial representation in Western painting. Dunning describes changes in the 60s as a shift from exploring the felt experience of space and different ways to describe it to something more like a visual discussion exploring the relationship between what's real, the illusion of this reality, and the function of signs and symbols and the realm of semiotics. Things took a distinctly philosophical and linguistic turn. One artistic statement that was hard to miss was Rauschenberg's piece, in which, as a young man, he erased a drawing by de Kooning. De Kooning had given him a drawing. He asked for a drawing. De Kooning gives him a drawing. Rauschenberg promptly erases the drawing and then exhibits it. Pop art was followed quickly by minimalism, then post-minimalism, and the death of painting. Artists started to more overtly test the boundaries of art. Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, both exploring a geometric, materialist approach. An early work by Richard Serra, one by Eva Hesse. These works can be seen as exploring materials in a non-romantic, non-subjective attitude. What you see is what you get. We then had the resurrection of painting occurring in the 1980s with Neo-Expressionism. Here's some examples. There's a Julian Schnabel, Michel Basquiat, one by Eric Fischl, bringing back the high-end market and headlines for the possibilities of painting, subjective interiority, etc. And a great eclectic situation begins with no grand direction, no overarching style, and the beginning of the possibility of no more straight road, no more ism, no more new direction for art. The term postmodernism came into play, trying to come to terms with this new situation of eclectic uncertainty. A good book covering this period from the beginning of the 20th century through the 1980s is by Robert Hughes, The Shock of the New. The 90s arrived, and we had the great rise of multiculturalism in the arts in all sorts of ways, of doing all sorts of things in all sorts of directions, in places all over the world. Julian Stalabras, in his book Art Incorporated, looks at the parallels between the rise of multiculturalism in the art world and the rise of a global economy. It's kind of silly doing these books, but no, it's okay? It's all right. They've been helpful. Okay. When I returned back to the States in 2002 and trying to get a handle on what was happening in the art world, I also started to read essays by Arthur Danto. Danto was a professor emeritus from Columbia who wrote extensively on art and was a critic for The Nation. Among his many books is After the End of Art, where he describes his encounter with Warhol's Brillo box. He encounters Warhol's Brillo box in the 1960s and how that posed certain questions for him that led him to certain conclusions. I won't go into all the ins and outs, But the gist of it was that art had basically fulfilled its role and no longer needed to be art as such. People would continue to make and exhibit stuff, but the larger need and trajectory for art was over. There was no longer a cultural need for a specific direction and grand style. One of the people Danto mentioned in his book was another art historian and critic, Hans Belting, who had come to a similar conclusion on his own. I followed the trail and read Belting's book, Art History After Modernism. I found it riveting, and up to that point, the best writing I'd found on our current situation in the art world. It was like watching a great boxer land punch after punch, powerful and without any apparent malice, as he posed incisive questions and suggested possible answers. So, were we at some kind of cultural cul-de-sac, stuck or adrift? A few years back, I picked up another book, this time by Larry Shiner, The Invention of Art. His book describes the cultural invention of the category of fine art as we know it. Ways of thinking and relating to art that I always thought had been around since the Renaissance turn out to have more recent roots and really only coalesced and entered mainstream European culture in the 18th century. This entailed the grouping together of painting, sculpture, music, poetry, and to some extent architecture into the fine arts, les beaux-arts. Art was separated from craft, artist from artisan, and utility from pleasure, or what became aesthetics. There were two main things that allowed these changes to occur. One was the shift economically from a feudal to a capitalist economy with a rising middle class, which helped create a wider market for art, whether that meant literary journals, outdoor concerts, or paintings for home furnishings. There were also changes in the intellectual categories and a regrouping of knowledge. Previously, music was grouped with mathematics, poetry with rhetoric, painters with pharmacists. Both used mortars to ground their minerals. These economic and cultural shifts created and supported the fine arts as a new cultural category. Creativity went from being the sole prerogative of the divine creator to a special attribute, perhaps even a spiritual one, which humans could exhibit. The way we think about art and the artist and what it means to us culturally began about 250, 300 years ago. This is still a huge chunk of time, but it has a definite beginning and development. What we call art and its role turns out not to be inevitable, not immovable. Making, yes. Human creative making, yes. But what art means, who is an artist, and what is the art world, the context and meaning. Perhaps these are more flexible than I had thought. And perhaps this last half century has witnessed a radical revision. I found the whole thing shocking and revelatory. I began to explore the work of Joseph Beuys, the German performance installation artist. Another book I picked up was What is Art?, which has a lengthy interview with Beuys. In it, he states his belief that every person is an artist. How can that be? What does that even mean? Beuys coined the term social sculpture and saw the scope of art as actually that of society and civilization and life itself. How do we create a world that provides the opportunity and means for everyone to explore and express their own artist self in whatever medium or means is most appropriate? What would such a world look like? My thoughts about who I am as a painter started to shift. What does it mean that I make? What does it mean that I paint? Now, let's move more fully into our current situation. A couple of years ago, I was curious about what Hans Belting, the fellow I had found through reading Danto, had been up to, and found a recent publication of his from 2013. The Global, Contemporary, and the Rise of New Art Worlds. Oh, I forgot that one. That was Joseph Beuys. That's in a performance piece with a coyote. He's in a room with a coyote. It's a true story. So that's the Global Contemporary. Co-edited together with Peter Webel and Andrea Budenzeig. The book attempts to give a handle and scope to our current global explosion of contemporary art. It comes at it with a wide variety of information and directions, and quite profoundly changed my sense not only of contemporary art, but of what is occurring all over the planet. A vast global grassroots explosion of creativity. 1989 turns out to be a watershed year. It was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, the ascendance of a free market global economy, and the exhibition in Paris of Magicians de la Terre. This actually isn't from that exhibition, although it has the title, but this was in 2014, looking back on the exhibition from 1989, but it's a good-looking photo, so that's what we're doing. 50 artists, this exhibition, curated by Jean-Hubert Martin, was organized in a way that had never previously occurred. 50 artists in the traditional Western sense were exhibited in a mix with 50 non-Western artists who had largely not been represented in the art system before. The exhibition generated a shift of attention from seeing the West as the center of the art world to a more worldwide perspective. The exhibition can be seen as trying to even up the playing field in a post-colonial world. No more British Empire, no more Soviet Empire, standing up to American power. This shift has been termed culturally as a post-colonial turn. And I need to confess my own first reaction to all this post-colonial stuff. As a painter who loves Cézanne, Titian, Rembrandt, Chardin, I had a hell of a time making sense of this as art. I could certainly understand, admire, support the desire and action for political and social freedom. But what does that have to do with art? And I began to understand that what was happening here was a vast global striving for personal freedom, human freedom, and that one of the ways this has taken place has been through creative expression that has most efficiently been housed and shared as art. The notion of globalization took hold. Here's a whole series of terms using global and when it first moved into our vocabulary. The cover from Art in America. And biennials began to proliferate. Before 1989, there were approximately 25 biennials. As of 2013, the number had risen to 159. The burgeoning of the biennial since 1990 could be seen, in part, as an attempt by local and regional areas around the world to showcase and give attention to their own specific histories and cultural forms of current art and creativity. Concurrently and in relation to that, but from the perspective of the art market, has been the rise of the art fairs. Since the 1990s, we've had about 1 or 2 open each year, and there were about 44 as of 2013. There were other market stats that I also found interesting, helping me get a handle on what's going on in the name of art. The global art market runs about $50 billion a year. About 10% of that is derived from the sale of contemporary art. This book gave me an opportunity to look at a wide range of aspects of a very complex situation. The market, the money, the post-colonial turn, the changing role and identity of the museum, and the many various modernities. I was well aware of what I always thought of as modernity, but I began to understand that every region on Earth has its own trajectory and story and specifics. South America came into and through the 20th century differently than Western Europe and the United States. Eastern Europe differently than post-colonial Africa. Different parts of Asia, Oceania, China, again, different. Once I saw that, of course, well, that's sort of self-evident, but I never really slowed down and thought about modernity from different perspectives. And each set of differences has given rise to a different mix of global and local aesthetic concerns and values. The great shift that occurred with the birth of modernity, with French Impressionisms, Monet, Cézanne, etc., is an essential story, but just one story in the midst of a great planetary shift. One modernity among many, crucial because of its power and impact and catalyzing quality, but still one modernity story among many. So I found myself somewhat excited and dizzy with the array and complexity and fullness of what I was starting to get a glimpse of. This great explosion of creativity under the heading of contemporary art all over planet Earth. But what exactly is contemporary art? Is it just whatever people make today? What's the difference between modern art and contemporary art? Is there one? So here's one last book. By Terry Smith. And I found him through reading his essay in The Global Contemporary that I just described. Smith's book is entitled, fittingly, What is Contemporary Art? And he begins by asking, what is this term contemporary? He starts with the basics, different things, different conditions occurring at the same time. You and I, we're both here, we're different, and we're contemporaries. Then Smith begins to unpack it further. How is the sense of contemporary now, in the world that we now find ourselves? How is being now different than, say, 50 years ago when the world was modern? Smith uses the term contemporaneity to describe this shift, and he makes two contentions. The first is that our contemporaneity is the most evident aspect of our current world, and two, that art today is shaped most profoundly by its situation within this contemporaneity. So then, what is it? What is this contemporaneity? One salient, inescapable aspect is the ongoing, relentless experience of otherness. Other cultures, other ideas and ideologies, other religions and values, banging up against each other. Relentless adjacency. We can't avoid each other. Not only is my world, our world here, but their world is here too, constantly. Not only does this occur in the political and sociological sphere, but also with our inner sense of identity and inner life. Straight sexual identity, gay identity, fluid sexual identity, liberalism, conservatism, fundamentalism, socialism. There are, in Smith's terms, constant frictions of multiplicitous difference that we are continuously confronted by, deeply different experiences of time and place and cultural values. Smith attributes this particular experience of contemporaneity and friction to three sets of forces. The first is globalization itself, with its desire to gain and maintain control over the planet, economically, sociologically, politically, in the face of increasing cultural differentiation in a post-colonial world. Just think of the recent Kurdish and Basque votes for independence. This, together with the desire for the continued, unfettered use of the Earth's natural resources in the face of increasing evidence of the unsustainability of the whole thing. This isn't a question of whether it's ethical, but simply whether it's even doable. The second set of forces is the increasing state of inequity among peoples and individuals. The enormous wealth disparity in the world accelerates the overall instability. And thirdly, and I'll use Smith's words here, we are all willy-nilly immersed in an infoscape, or better, a spectacle, an image economy, capable of the instant and thoroughly mediated communication of all information and any image, anywhere. It is, at the same time, fissured by the uneasy coexistence of open, volatile subjects and rampant popular fundamentalisms. Think of the range of what can get served up on the web immediately. Taken together, this all becomes a recipe for a constant churning of reactivity and friction. We can't avoid the bombardment and upset of otherness, the bewilderment and lack of comprehension. What in the world is going on over there, wherever there is? So there is also the desire to retreat, to isolate, and to locate comfort in the familiar. We live in a time of massive and unstable complexity and uncertainty. So then Smith describes how he sees art being made today in this situation of our extremely complex contemporaneity. And he teases out three major kinds of work. The first he labels remodernizing and spectacle art, work that continues attitudes found in modernity and the high-end relationship to the global art market. In the remodernizing aspect, we find artists who utilize strategies that are more or less familiar and come more directly out of modernism, like Gerhard Richter, Richard Serra. We also see artists that are more bombastic, like Jeff Koons, Damien Hirst, which Smith terms more as spectacle art. The second strand of the contemporary he finds more in political critique and protest grounded in post-colonial reaction and issues of identity. Artwork that takes on environmental and feminist issues would be found here. Works by Carl Walker would fit into this, exploring race relations currently and historically in the United States. Here is a piece by William Kentridge dealing with the trauma of South Africa's history. This is an installation by Doris Salcedo, working with the disappeared of Colombia and issues of forgetting and memory. The third and last arena of contemporary art that Smith describes is more subtle. And I'd like to read at length Smith's own words in describing it. The third current is different in kind from the others. The outcome largely of a generational change occurring as the first two have unfolded, rejecting gratuitous provocation and grand symbolic statements in favor of specific, small-scale, and modest offerings, remixes elements of the first two currents, but with less and less regard for their fading power structures and styles of struggle, and more concern for the interactive, potentialities. These artists seek to arrest the immediate, to grasp the changing nature of time, place, media, and mood today. They make visible our sense that these fundamental, familiar constituents of being are becoming each day steadily stranger. Within the world's turnings and life's frictions, they seek sustainable flows of survival, cooperation, and growth. Here are two works dealing with a changing relationship to time as we know it in the workaday world. This first piece is by James Turrell. Here is one by Turkey Tolson Chuparula, an Aboriginal artist. Theaster Gates also comes to mind, and his community work in Chicago. There is a phenomenal burgeoning of human creativity all over the planet amidst this crazy-ass situation we're all in. Where does that leave us as viewers of art? What about traditional experiences of visual beauty? Do I have to accept the cacophony and chaos? What does it really mean to make room for otherness, living with dissonance? When it comes to art, which is something that lives inside of me, making room for dissonance and otherness can get extremely unsettling. It's not just tolerating the difference and hoping it will go away, but somehow making room inwardly for that dissonant friction as an honored manifestation of a great, creative, planetary awakening. And where does this leave me as a painter? How does all this affect my studio practice? I don't mean making sure that my work passes a litmus test for contemporaneity, but rather how to use my understanding of our contemporary situation as a way of accessing deeper levels and implications of what I am already engaged in and have that impact my ongoing authentic process. And as a teacher of painting, where does painting fit in the larger scheme of things, and how is it relevant? What would it mean to teach painting in a way that equips students with skills and tools and a context, not only with roots in the Renaissance and the great inventions of modernity, but with a working understanding of our inescapable contemporaneity in our current actual world? These are questions I've been working on, both as a painter and as a teacher, and I have some tentative answers, but I'll save those for another time. Let me just say now, very briefly, that I believe it relates to painting's inherent aspect of interconnectivity and our own interbeing. In closing, here we are, wherever this is. Here is an image from the Chauvet cave paintings from approximately 30,000 years ago. In these times of immersion in the virtual and our enormous uncertainty, certain inherent aspects of handmade image making, such as touch, actuality, and presence, have become more clear as to their essential importance. I'd like to read a quote from John Berger from his essay, Steps Towards a Small Theory of the Visible, from his book, The Shape of a Pocket. He writes, very briefly, "Today, to try to paint the existent is an act of resistance, instigating hope." Thank you. So we have time for questions, and then if anyone would like to come down and look at these books, that's why I really brought them, if anyone's interested. I will also be posting a book list on my website, so you can go there and find it. But I'd like, if there's any questions, there was a lot of material I tried to cover in a short amount of time. Yes?
How has this influenced you in particular? How has your art developed over the past 10, 15 years?
I had a show at the DFN Gallery in 2005, and it went fine, but it didn't function the way I had experienced the work in my studio. So after that, I went to the work I was doing in my studio, and I started to think about, things that I did back when I was in my 20s, but stylistically it looked different than what I was then doing now in 2005, and I realized I could do whatever I want to do. I mean, just looking around at what was happening in the art world, it was clear that everything was open, that I didn't need to constrict myself in any way if I felt pulled to try something. So I started doing that. And then over time, I realized, that there were ways that I was working that as I started to think about it, different aspects of ways of being. I mean, I don't want to get too, but I play stylistically very much. My work has a range of attitudes the way I play. And so that there's difference, even though I'm dealing with the same motif. I'm not going to unpack that further, but I don't want to get too caught up in my own.
You don't have any examples?
The image that was advertising the talk. There was there was the black and white still life. Then there was this pink square. Then there was this still life that seemed like it was kind of fractured. It was all kind of flurry, and that was a triptych of a still life of flowers done in 3 different states. And the pink one, if you stand in front of it slowly, you start to see, it's the same thing. Right? So I'm working from observation, and I'm exploring the motif in front of me, but in 3 distinctly different ways, and then juxtaposing them together. And there's something about the way those 3 start to tease my mind into something that's in between them, that's not seen. That interests me. Yeah, I don't know if that answers. We can have a beer sometime. We'll go over. Other questions? Thanks. Yes, Paul? Again?
You mentioned interbeing in presence. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay. Interbeing was a term that I first. Interbeing is a term I first heard or read through Charles Eisenstein's book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And I looked it up, and apparently it was coined by Thich Nhat Hanh. And he's using it to describe our actual reality. And in that sense, our experience of separateness isn't final. That's our experience in a daily way, but that more fundamentally, we are actually experiencing our interbeing. This is one being, and we just happen to be talking to ourselves here, you and me, you see. Where the separateness is an illusion. It's not actual. So that's where the term interbeing is trying to point us towards. presence is the experience of that recognition. Not intellectually, but experientially, when, say, two aspects of one interbeing recognizes itself as connected. When consciousness recognizes consciousness, we go, oh, and we feel that. And that's presence. Kind of heavy. Eckhart Tolle talks about it in Power of Now. He unpacks that, and better than I can. I mean, I'm just giving, I don't know. But well, okay, that's like in a meta. But presence is, in a daily way, presence is. When it could be in nature, or a building that's been used in some very special way, and you walk in and say, oh, there's something in this space, I feel that. Or you look at a great work of art, or just a beautiful vase or something, it's like, or even a person, and they don't, it's not necessarily charisma, there's an energy. So that's in a more, less, was it 50,000 down? Yeah.
You talked about your response to your triptych.
Yeah.
Is that an example of interbeing in a way, speaking to each other, and then something else appears, but they're connected?
Yeah, well, there's certainly, for me, there's something that happens when I'm, yeah, the triptych.
Just repeat the question.
Oh, I don't know. Can you stand up and say that again?
I was just curious, you talked about your response to the triptych
Yeah.
as producing something else that wasn't really any one of those.
Yeah, what's my response to the triptych was something other than to each panel by itself. There was something else going on. Was that related to interbeing? What happens for me when I move from one panel to the next, or one mode of exploring to the other, and then another, is that I start to I notice my mind shifting as I go from one to the other, and then I can start to locate something that's underneath the appearances. And then I start to have a sense of something, but I don't perceive it. I'm just experiencing it. And yes, I suppose that's related to interbeing. That is, it's being. Let me just call it being. There's something about the experience of being that I have access to more directly as I go underneath appearances. Yeah, Ro?
When you talk about your teaching your students the new way of the art world or contemporary art, are you teaching that now?
Well, to some extent, we have a reading group, and we have been going over stuff. I mean, not right now, we're not, but it comes up. I mean, it's something that once I get something in my head, I don't stop talking about it. So I'm always harping on something.
When is the reading group?
Tuesday nights.
In Boulder?
No, Lafayette. Yeah. Yeah. Kate.
Can you come back out to Cape Cod? We have next week
Yeah.
an important conference going on
Okay.
about the political aspect of defunding culture.
Uh-huh.
Basically, it's coming out of fine arts, but it's also the
Right.
Catskill.
Uh-huh.
And the thought came to me when you were saying this that Steve and I had an opportunity 4
Oh, wow.
with Isabel Rojas,
Wow.
who's a big voice in that.
Uh-huh.
And the way that she structured the journey was to take the image of Che, because it was something that most of us were in our 60s or 70s that were going. It was something we all, grew up around, came of age around.
Okay.
And when you start talking about the globalization of these images,
Mm-hmm.
I would just love to hear you speak for a really long time about when that image gets so expanded and so multicultural.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
It seems as though Isabel would say, because she goes all over the world to look at all the important political murals
Uh-huh.
that still remain, and
Yeah.
she raises funds to see that they don't get erased,
Uh-huh.
that the next generation is
Right.
Can that image that you're talking about that becomes so global,
Uh-huh.
okay, can it also become personal?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And does that then have a political aspect to
It
it?
sure can,
Yeah,
of course.
That I think you're right on. I think you're an important voice right now in this world.
Well, thank you.
I hope you're being heard. It's something I hope this generation that you're raising and the
know.
children and grandchildren I have
Yeah.
need to know about art as not some adjunct thing to dinner.
Yeah.
It's not like dessert. It's
Right.
essential.
Well, there's something about, I do think we're in the middle of, and this is, I feel in some way I'm coming late to the situation in that it's been going on since the 1960s, this giant attempt to reframe what is this human creativity. And I think that there's a real, we're watching a real struggle as we sort it out, all these different forces that are at play. And that's part of what we're watching, and participating in different ways. And they need each other. That is, one of the interesting things when looking at the global contemporary is it was clear there was some kind of struggle going on between, the international art market and these grassroots, all over the planet, people doing stuff, and kind of a race. Who was going to win in terms of being free to do what they want or being controlled in order to serve a larger market? But it was also clear that those two aspects need each other. They're not, and so how are, this whole interplay, yeah, it's not clear how it's all playing out at all. We're in the middle of something that's, uncertain. Yeah.
Can you speak to, I talk about this a lot in my own world.
Excuse me, could you stand up and talk? I can't hear it.
Oh,
Please?
okay.
On spot now.
In my world and how I connect to art, I talk a lot about galleries and the future of galleries.
Uh-huh.
I know a lot of artists. I'm not an artist myself, but I promote a lot of art and artists. And
Right.
I have personally been saying that I think the paradigm is changing. And in fact,
Sure.
I think it has already changed.
Sure.
I think the paradigm has changed, and many people don't know it's changed.
Yeah.
And I guess my shorthand for why that change has happened
Yeah.
is connected to the internet.
Absolutely.
To me, the internet is the most key thing there. Can you speak to that a little bit, or do you have any thoughts?
Well,
about
I think it's absolutely been changing. There's still a role for galleries, very particularly, first of all, in order to have, exhibitions and first-person experiences of the work and being able to really experience the work beyond a digital image. And so we need that, but it's also clear that the galleries need the art fairs. And it also is clear that so much work is being sold digitally through either through websites or through Instagram, so there's a giant flux, and none of it's clear how, nothing's steady anymore, that's for sure. I think the galleries are struggling because of all of that and to figure out how to make it work. Because art fairs are certainly, that's expensive, and how to promote the work in a way that really serves the work and the artist and keeps the gallery going. And how do you get critical response if you don't have a show?
Well, and connected to that, you know, who are the arbiters
Yeah.
of work? Because I think that has gone beyond the gallery. Sorry for any galleries here.
Oh yeah.
But and who are the new arbiters?
Well, it's a mix. I mean, now, the internet's done a very strange thing. It's democratized in a very real way. YouTube and Instagram and culture is just. But it's also affected our sense of quality. It's also affected, all those pieces. There's a William Dereshowitz, I think is how you say his name. He wrote an article in The Atlantic at the end of 2014 called "The Death of the Artist and the Birth of the Creative Entrepreneur," or something like that. And he talked about the shift, and that, it's worth looking at. And I just can echo what you're saying. I just think we're in a great flux, and it's not clear how it's all going to shake out. And that's one of the things that I'm talking about, at the very end here, that there's something about a handmade image. It's got physicality, and it has energetic presence. And that doesn't show up on the web. But we are all habituated to, of course, browsing, and yes, it's our world, and we are slipping in our minds, imagining one for the other, It's just this little tiny thumbnail, and it's like, oh, I like it, I don't like it. We have no idea how it works until we're standing actually in front of it. And then probably we need some time, too. Imagine that, actually standing with time in front of something. And so there's something, it's odd. On the one hand, we have this incredible global economy of images, and yet in another way, we really need to sort of invest locally in local sharing of real stuff that we can encounter with our bodies, How else can we really feel it, Yeah. Yes?
What you presented tonight is fantastic, because I didn't know how to put it into words. But the one thing that I thought was amazing after the November election last year, I have a lot of friends on Facebook who are artists from all over the world, and all of a sudden artists just started putting their art up every day.
Uh-huh.
And to
Right.
oppose the other discussion that was going on. And I saw the power of art.
Yeah.
And it just kind of emerged. There was no
Yeah.
leader to it.
Yeah. Something's going on.
And so something's
Yeah.
going on, but I didn't know how to put voice to it. You did tonight.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
I'd just like to add our thanks, the directors and people of FOPAS, for bringing Jordan to give us some very different insights into the art market, how it's changing, and of course the effects of the internet, but just philosophically in particular, what's happening in the art world and what has happened. So Jordan, thank you very much for that, and we look forward to hearing more. Thanks again.